I don't know how many of y'all feel about this, but the topic of bringing ourselves to work, you're not going to hear me for the next hour suggest that this is not something we should do, right? Like it would be pretty, I think, surprising to come to a conference and be like, in fact, this is not what we're looking to do as an HR team. But I also want to acknowledge, I think that um, this phrase is something that I think a lot of people champion, but don't always appreciate the complexity that comes with trying to make this happen and what it looks like for individuals. So you're also not going to hear me over the next hour just be like, let's just all dive in. It's going to be great. It's going to be easy. Um, what the goal of this session is to talk about the complexities and the nuances and try to figure out if we're really going to try to create workplaces that allow people to integrate themselves into it. How do we do that in a way that minimizes difficulty, hardship, and let's just be honest, trauma, and maximizes the ability for people to figure that out in ways that are productive for everyone. Does that make sense? Cool. And I'm just going to ask, keep me honest, right? If you hear things throughout the session, like, I want this to be a dialogue, I want this to be a discussion. I'm not just going to talk at you for an hour. So I'm going to ask you to share your experiences. But again, something we do at my company, Step Outside, we do something called challenge by choice. So, like, any conversations we have in this room, any discussions we have, like, the choice is always yours to decide the degree to which you want to engage. So I would just ask that we also maintain that norm here as we have these discussions. With that in mind, here's what we're going to try to tackle today. One, talking about individual and team factors that employees need in order to thrive in places. Also acknowledge and talk about the costs of failing to create cultures that are based on learning and growth and moving in that direction. And then give you hopefully some emotional skills that you can take with you and start implementing on your own or folding in at the team level. The other like broader context that I just wanted to set really quickly, I woke up this morning and I was like scrolling through LinkedIn. That probably tells you a little bit about like who I am as a person. Um, but one thing I was really intrigued by, and I just found myself getting curious about, is I came across a post that was celebrated and it was like very viral. I thought it was really interesting. It was someone who was sharing publicly on LinkedIn about their transgender identity and was saying, this impacts my professional like workplace. Here we are, like, this is true. Here's what I would appreciate. Here's what I would prefer. I was like, this, like, my personal take on that is like, that's courageous, vulnerable, and something we probably wouldn't have seen on LinkedIn a decade ago, right? It just like wouldn't exist there. And then I like tried to stop myself, but behaviors are hard. I went down to the comments, and sure enough, I saw like there were lots of people who were like incredibly supportive, celebratory. There were some people who were evidently critical on like the scale of like their own personal beliefs. Obviously, were getting in the way of them supporting someone else. Um, there were, I feel like these are more subtle critics, and I just like want to have a conversation with these people. There are some folks being like, why is this on LinkedIn? As if they're like championing like what a social media platform ought to be. But we all have opinions about that. There were also educators, right? People being like, well, if you read the post, it said very clearly that this impacts me, like this person professionally. And so like maybe just go back and read the post with a critical eye. Um, and so I was seeing all of that happening. I had my own, of course, personal feelings about like the appropriateness of the comments and the responses. But I think it set a larger context that we are in the midst of a transition. And when I think about the theme of this conference, about redefining what our places look like, I think that post is a microcosm of what a lot of people are like. We're living through a question and we're going through a lot of opinions about like what is the right way to be in the workplace as we respond to a pandemic that we're still kind of going through, like lots of force. It doesn't exist. I don't know. Is it over? Right? It depends on who you ask. Um, so I think as all of those opinions circulate, there's a lot going on right now to like to think about what do our workplaces look like. How do we want to shape them going forward? And so I'm hopeful that this conversation about like feeling integrated into our workplace, like if we're going to do that, how do we do it in a way that's respectful, safe, inclusive, and um, and when do we decide certain things about us aren't going to be showing up in the workplace, but we still feel whole? So those are the questions we're going to try to get at today. So if you have a pen with you and a notepad, please feel free to do this. If you're a digital person, also fine, pull up a little note on your phone or, like, text yourself. I just want to start off with an exercise. So I'm gonna ask you, you can pull from this emotion or feelings list if you want. You can also add your own, but I just want you to come up with a list of 10 feelings or emotions that you experienced throughout the pandemic at be a minute or 2 to Also, if you're struggling to get 10, that's okay. Brené Brown would say, like, most people can name 3. So I'm already extending, I'm setting the bar really high. I'm hopeful that the word list, though, will You're so welcome. Cool. For those of you who are finishing up, please feel free to take a couple more minutes. The words aren't gonna go away, but the request or the direction is gonna change. So I want you to go to your list once you've got your 10. I want you to circle the emotions or feelings that you would feel comfortable sharing with people on your team. There is not a right or wrong answer, it's just a self-assessment. So please just, like, do it objectively. This is just for you. Once you've got those circled, I'd ask you to do something I'm not very good at. I was an English teacher, not a math teacher, but I want you to calculate the percentage of feelings or emotions that you listed that you would be comfortable sharing. The good news and why I chose 10 is because calculating averages based on 10 is much easier than other random numbers. There you go, right? So it's like, this is why 5 out of 10, 50%. I'm gonna ask as folks are finishing this up, just to share out a bit. Again, not necessarily you don't have to share out the content of the emotions that you're comfortable feeling or not, but I'm curious, um, throw a couple questions your way in addition to this. So, like, uh, anyone notice in themselves a desire like, "Wow, I wish that number was bigger?" Anyone have that experience? Um, anyone like, "Oh, I'm really comfortable." That's, like, a good signal. I think these self-assessments are useful, right? Just be like, "Do I feel safe and encouraged to be myself, workplace?" Um, any other trends? Anyone notice anything that was interesting? Yeah. It's amazing how, like, Yeah, when moving from a state of paralysis to a state of action is one difficult change state. Uh, and sometimes it's also our thoughts. It's like, how is this gonna go? Like, yeah, that maps onto not my most recent work experience, but a former work experience that had a lot of trauma in the classroom, and I did something very similar. And I think what's useful for us to think about is when we look back, question, it's like, okay, if that were to happen again, or what realistically, maybe not when a pandemic happens again, but when a state of deep uncertainty happens, like, was the response I chose most effective way for me to balance my own with role requires? And so that's a large part of what we're doing here, which is like, how can we just be attentive to our thoughts, help us take care of ourselves while taking care of part of. I love that. Um, anyone willing to? I'm curious. Um, to this second question, anyone have thoughts like what what do you think is required for people to be willing to share more open? What's needed? Good stuff. Trust. Yep. Empathy. A lack of judgment. Yep. Openness. Y'all should have just led this presentation. No, I think that's spot on, right? These are things that we all know, right? We know in our bones. I think the tough thing often is just like, how do we balance that? Is what we're second. Um, any other reactions or insights? Please. Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate that courage sharing that because I think it points to something that's true that all of us like a lot of a lot of employees that come here are like, great, I'm just gonna throw everything at HR, right? And then it's like, where does HR go to like resource themselves, right? So I think it's like really brilliant that you're calling out like being in community with other people who are just acknowledging, wow, we've been carrying heavy weight for a long time. It's tough. Um, that really does speak to the balance of like we're all here mostly love supporting, get energy, from it, but it is also training, right? You're not robots. So just think it's powerful to share like you want to be authentic, but you don't have an endless cup to pour. So anything else? Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned. I have a very similar style, or at least initially. Yeah, it's like really easy to share the celebration, but then it's like, oh, is there a place for the harder emotions? Um, I think there are a lot of good questions about like where's the appropriate place, but you're gonna have a hard time convincing me that there's all of our emotions in the workplace. Like we are not say that we're not robots, right? We are people, and feelings that we all have, and anyone who tells you differently is really nervous to feel them in certain places because they don't feel like it's safe. So I think that like I respect where they're sit. Probably really they might. Um, awesome. Okay. The other question that kind of extends from this: what happens when trust and belonging are absent, right? Or maybe they're there in pockets, but it's not pervasive. What comes up instead? Good for business or bad? Yeah. Awful, right? Because you're closing off feedback loops and putting them in these little tight circles. Absolutely. What else? A lack of yeah. Yeah. And I mean, let's just be honest, right? Like as many of us have skills to build, but most people have spent the most amount of their time in their lives interacting with others. So pretty much everyone I know, uh, like accepting some like neurodivergence and stuff like that. Most people that I interact with day to day are incredibly skilled at judging authenticity and assessing whether or not they feel like someone is right. It's like the thing that we spend the most time in our lives doing. So most of us are quite skilled at it. Um, some more than others, what have you, but I think it's important to acknowledge that. So a lack of authenticity makes it really hard. Anything else? Lack of engagement. Yeah. And to be fair, right, the act of work as an employee, like, to me, unless I have the ideal dream job, right, which is very possible, I think, um, but I'm contributing, right? And so, like, my ability to contribute without feeling any sort of reciprocity or connection, like, that's gonna go down if I don't have that. Yeah. Again, feel like y'all session. So thank you for your insight. Yeah. Yeah, that's so right. I also joke about, like, "See, Matt, you said all the things." Um, yeah, I think that's right. When there's a lack of trust and belonging, right, we know that turnover, disengagement, ineffective communication, that stuff runs rampant. And so I wanted to start with the heart-centered stuff because these are the things that y'all deal with daily. Uh, the other thing that I think is really important to look at, which I'll be honest, when I started this whole journey with Step Outside, I was like, I think I probably got to start convincing people that this actually is possible. And so what I did here, and I'm going to encourage you to bring it up if you want. I put together a calculator to measure like the impact of turnover, disengagement, ineffective communication. Um, so feel the link go here is stepoutside.us/impact. It's totally free. I'm not gonna like collect your email or anything like that. Just want you to have this as a resource. Um, if you go to it, we've got a lot of the data listed here, like what we're actually measuring, access that, and communicate it. Please feel free to do that. But essentially, what we do here, and I'm just gonna put in some numbers. Um, we have you insert some basic information. Also, I probably should be like collecting data and using this in an effective way, but I'm not, so you don't have to worry about it. Maybe someday. Um, but you put in your company size, like estimated revenue, you can ballpark this stuff. But if you want to go back to your teams and be like really concrete about it, please do. And then we make some assumptions based on the data, like disengagement numbers tend to be between, or turnover numbers tend to be between 15 and 20%, right? So we're basing on like larger industry metrics. If you know yours, you can do the same math. But I'm gonna just pop in some numbers. Um, again, that I'm ballparking here. Um, but I think it's just helpful to look at. The other thing to note, if you're using it on your phone, don't put in commas. I don't know why that breaks it. But let's just go through this together. So the company that I'm currently supporting in an L&D function for leadership development is between like 600 and 700 people. I truly don't know our annual revenue, but I'm going to guess that we're like around 40 million or something like that. So I'm going to make sure I get my zeros correct. Three, think I did it. Think I did that right. Call me out if I didn't. Um, again, I don't actually have this data. You may have this information or be able to access it in your role, so you can again be more precise about this. I'm gonna guess we're probably around like an average of 75K. Um, and then say my current team size is around 8, and then I start just filling in some turnover numbers. Um, I just did, again, basic turnover, so, like, 15 to 20%, do a round number here. And so you could start to see the cost per employee for disengagement, for ineffective communication. And there's also a bit down here about like what happens when we actually focus on people's strengths, help them grow. You actually could see a bump in productivity, which is going to decrease your costs, right? Or decrease the losses. And you can see with the numbers I plugged in, again, I don't think the numbers I plugged in are relevant to you. I think you should put in your numbers. Um, but on my team alone annually, we would be losing 220K and our company is losing like $13. Um, I think what's hard when you show these sorts of things to leadership is that many of them are like, but there's not a way to solve that, right? It's like we can change a system and they're like, I see, we can like take out that system and plug in this system and then it works. Um, but I think if leaders actually put their head around like, we can train people, we can develop them, we can help them grow. Um, and doing that doesn't cost $13 million dollars a year to train our team. Um, maybe we could invest like 50K or 100K. Like that seems worth it. Um, and so in case it's useful for you, feel free to use it. It's there. Again, I don't want your data. I don't want anything. I just want you to have tools to be able to communicate in addition to like people feel left out of work. They don't feel engaged. They like culture is lacking. You have some numbers back. Any thoughts, reactions, questions about this? Cool. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So we agree the qualitative experience of being a person in a culture that's lacking really crappy. Also, the quantitative experience is, I think, really problematic. And for people who are numbers driven, like leaders at the top of the company, hopefully that's telling for them. Um, so I guess one of the other questions when I think about things like psychologically, one of the questions is like, okay, why? Why is this happening? And this is not the I would say this is certainly not the only reason, but I think when I zoom out and look at broader trends, and if I'm being honest, I currently live in 2 roles. Like, I am an employee at a company as an individual contributor manager, right? Middle manager IC position, and I'm also a founder of a company. And so I live in these 2 places, and what I can appreciate and understand is that I think leaders more than anything want dependable, results-driven employees, right? You've never been in a founder's position or a, like, C-suite position to give a little compassion to them. I think the reason they focus so much on that is because their constant thought is like, we don't keep going, this whole thing fails. And so like this is gonna stop working. And if it stops, it's my job to make sure that it works. And so if it stops working, no one has a job and we can't like move toward this vision. That's like a pretty scary place to be in consistently. Um, having been on the employee side, it's like, cool, yeah, I get that that's a concern, but there's another, there's like another company I could probably go join as an employee, right? So while I'm here, what I want most is trust, purpose, connection, to feel deeply tied to the people in my organization and to care about the work that I'm doing. What I think is true is that leaders who get it and companies that really understand it, they're willing to forego their short-term desire for dependable results-driven employees because no one just goes there. And they start to realize, like, oh, we build trust, purpose, and connection first. Like, what happens? Um, I think the hard thing though is to remember, like, their mindset is often and most frequently uh thinking about the fires that are coming up that are like real threats to the business urgently that could cause a lot of the people that they're trying to care for and employ to no longer be able. And so when we think about the approaches to work, again, I'm generalizing a bit, and I think like map this however you want with the leaders in your organization. Um, ways that we tend to be able to approach work that I think are distinct are like one is rapid and reactive, right? Move as quickly as we possibly can, react to the things that are coming up. And what that often looks like is like, let's solve short term problems. Um, let's focus on like getting quick wins. Resources are currently limited, so, like, let's do the most we can with whatever we have, and we just gotta do what we gotta do to survive. Um, there are I wanna and I you're obviously gonna hear me be like, "Responsive and resourceful is the way to go," right? Because I think it is, and I think behavior really it's context, right? In the pandemic, like, responsive and resourceful at the very beginning, like, no one even knew what that was. No one knew what the responsive and resourceful decision was, right? Um, and oftentimes, the way to get to responsive and resourceful decisions was to be rapid in the iterations and say, like, let's just focus on the next quick win, let's learn, and like, let's figure it out. We'll get there and let's stay flexible. So this is not purely me being like rapid and reactive is bad, responsive and resourceful is good, right? Like context really matters. I do think long term, you want to grow an organization that's going to thrive, the folks who build with responsiveness and resourcefulness in mind are going to be the folks who are most successful. Um, but when you look, zoom out, zoom in, different moments, we have to make these sorts of different times. But the approach of responsiveness and resourcefulness is really about like, can we build efficient systems that scale as we grow, or are we at least aware of like this is probably gonna we expect this to grow with us until like this point, and then stuff's gonna start breaking, right? So we have kind of an attention to that. Um, Focus on actually solving problems instead of just winning, right? Like the best thing you can do, especially from a customer lens, is like you actually provide a solution instead of just trying to win their money. Like you end up being more successful. Um, the mindset includes, I think, knowing that the resources exist. It might just be like, how do you access them and increase your ability to resource from them? And then I think the biggest one here is like in moments when we're in a survival mindset, we just aren't really open to taking information because we need to self-protect, right? That's the primary driver. When we can step back and look at things, we can adopt a learning mindset, and then we're like open to new information and consider paths, ways. Does this make sense? Cool. Um, the question is then like, okay, if we know zooming out, what we ultimately want to move toward as organizations is a responsive and resourceful one. The question becomes, how do we create that? Um, Read this really awesome article yesterday that gave me these three concepts that made just like my heart swell because I was like, this is what I was looking for. Um, I think culture is ultimately built on behaviors, systems, and practices. Um, the behavior, and as you can imagine, these are all interconnected, right? For anyone who is a really like linear thinker, I will try to be as helpful as possible, but I think this ultimately interacts like that. Um, Individual behaviors are actions that individuals can take to affect change within an organization, whether that's at the team level, the organization level, etc. You don't believe me? Look at the actions any C-suite leader takes within an organization and tell me that that does not influence the way that other people act in the organization, right? I think we would all agree it probably has the biggest impact, even when we have really good systems and practices in place. Um, so individual behaviors matter. On the other side, the far right, team practices. Um, these are like I see these as what small groups of people do together as a habit and routine that influence how we approach. It's how we meet together. It's what we make time for. It's what we practice. And the hope is, if we're doing it responsively and resourcefully, right? That's the mindset we have. The more that we practice responsiveness and resourcefulness, hopefully we can integrate those into organizational systems where we can take off some of the mental load of doing that. Um, what I like about systems and hate about systems is that you start to automate them and then you don't think about them. Um, and so we have these systems that end up being in place, and it's harder for our brains. We just want to go on autopilot. It's harder for our brains to reconsider what's working, what isn't. But the goal is for us to build practices that become systems, so that we don't have to put forth so much energy each time to like making culture. Um, Questions, reactions, skepticism, doubt about this. Just love to gauge. Is this useful? Is it cool? Okay. I'm going to share this. It's not that critical, but this is the part of the conversation where I think most people are like, okay, great, now go do it. They're just like, great, what do I do? So I'm going to endeavor to have us actually talk about like how do we actually build these things? One, like we all act and behave, so we don't have to learn about that. But like, how do we build practices and systems? And then the big thing is like a lot of people are like, just tell your people to go be more responsive and resourceful, and then everything will work. So let's actually practice and break down some of the things that are needed to be responsive and resourceful. Um, so emotional intelligence, probably not is this a new word to anyone at this point. We talk about it all the time. Just like go be more emotionally intelligent. What I want to spend a little time on today is like how. How do we actually do that? So we're going to talk about that in a second. Just to say it out loud, it's the ability to recognize, understand, and manage ourselves, what we think, what we feel, and to like, and probably how we act, and then also like see that in other people and potentially influence how they interact because we engage with them. Um, there's some data. It's really important, right? We all agree. Um, so that's important. The question I think that's really critical to ask is how do we do that? These are the individual behaviors or actions that I think create emotional intelligence, um, based on a lot of the research I've done and like holding some things together. So the first one is developing awareness. So bringing yourself into this moment, not being distracted by past stuff, by future stuff, um, getting curious about what's happening right now, um, and noticing what's happening around you. I suspect a lot of you are like, that sounds like mindfulness, right? And in fact, I think it is really, really similar, right? Um, I think that's why we're seeing a big wave and surge of this sort of like mental health focus in organizations because, in fact, we need it. Um, but yeah, the first part is learning to watch what you're thinking and feeling. I think sometimes we conflate that with like feel it. We must feel calm, right? Like I'm gonna go do this mindfulness stuff so I can like be good again. Uh, in my experience, it's just much more useful to be like, can you just watch? Can you see what's happening? Can you notice it? From there, it's about opening up to difficulty, right? A lot of us may be like, I'm angry. This sucks. This is the worst. And then we're like, I don't have time for that. I gotta do other stuff. So the second thing is how do we open ourselves up and validate the experience? I think bringing it back to one share out earlier, many of us don't feel comfortable sharing out our difficult experiences in the workplace. Probably one, because we're not willing to validate those experiences ourselves. We're not willing to like slow down and acknowledge like this is actually happening. Um, and because other people are like got these other work priorities. So it's not currently a team practice. Be like, hey, what you're experiencing is valid. And we may not be able to talk about it all day, but I just want you to know, or like we might not even be able to talk about it in this meeting. But if you want to follow up, I would be happy to make space for this at another time to validate experience and sit. Uh, so I think that's just like something that's on my mind. So opening up to that, the other part around difficulty is like I don't know if y'all feel this, but I struggle with this daily. The amount that I spend, the amount of thought energy I spend trying to solve for things that I can't control is amazing. It's like probably my like least productive strategy. It's like, if only I could just change that. Um, and so if we can learn just to be open to that, um, it can be really helpful. I want to do a quick exercise with that actually, just as a way, small little like 1 minute practice that you can work with. So I want you to start by, you'll do this with me. You can just do it by yourself. I know it's like a little awkward, but I'm going to have you hold both of your hands up. And I want you to turn one of your hands into a fist. I'm going to ask you to hold your other hand palm open. Um, Here's the hard part. Challenge by choice, remember, does not have to be the most difficult thing you do today. Um, I want you to bring up a thought that comes up for you frequently at work that is hard for you to be open to. I'll give you a few examples. Things that come up for me. I'm not good enough. Uh, you're a real idiot for doing X. um, whatever that person's experience was, like you're probably just like, you're not worthy of asking for that. Like you haven't done enough to show that you deserve that. These are things that come up for me. So find one of yours. again, it doesn't have to be like the hardest one, but I want you to just like bring it to mind, take 5 to 10 seconds to actually like, I know you can't conjure these sorts of thoughts, right? In a way that like makes it real and present right here, but bring it up so that like it sticks with you a little bit. And then I'll give you your next step. So just think about that thought. Um, Try to bring it up, make it as real as you can while we're sitting safely in a in a hotel. Um, and then I'll tell you what to do next. So once you've got it, I want you to take that thought from your head and I want you to throw it in both of your hands. So it's just going to sit here in both hands you have. And for the next like minute or so, probably 30 seconds, um, in the hand with the fist, I would encourage you to like clench it a little tighter as the 30 seconds goes on. Um, and then the other hand is just going to stay palm open. And I just want you to notice the difference between the experience of having your thought in both of those places. Does that make sense? So just take a moment to notice the difference between holding it tightly and keeping your palm open. All right, and when you're ready, you can put your hands down if you want. You go back. Love looking around the room. Some people like shake it out. Like one hand's like, whoo. Um, Other people will just like hold this here, which I think is interesting. But I'm curious, any thoughts, reactions to that? Just like quick little exercise. What came up for you? It felt better. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Please. Oh wow. Yeah. So like the open. Yeah, I love that. Right when we're open to a thing, there's when it feels fine, there's no desire to go the other way. But when we're holding tightly, I love that. Yeah. 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 I mean, it requires more energy, genuinely. Yeah. In the, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Um, that just makes so much sense. And also, does anyone still have like the residual? Like, there's a noticeable difference between how one is feeling than the other. And I think this is what's interesting, right? Um, who knows who to blame for this? I think we can blame culture to some degree, right? But I think many of us have grown up in places where we weren't taught to hold difficulty openly, right? It was like, this is something we must like fight, flee, freeze from. Also, it's biological, right? It's like what we're really practicing with there is like fight, flee, and freeze. That's what trying to control our experiences looks like. It's survival based, it's baked into us. You're not going to leave this session never doing that again. And that's actually a really good thing, right? Because there are times and there are contexts where like we need to take control and get out of the situation. And I think that's one of the nuances that I want to talk about. Um, to when I think about the LinkedIn post, right? Um, if that person goes into their workplace today and she's like, okay, I'm going to share this with everyone, um, but knows in the environment that it's not going to be supported, right? Like, while I admire and appreciate the courage and vulnerability that it would take to go and do that, um, I think we've got to be really considerate of like, is the environment built in a way that it like is effective for me to be able to do this safely without creating trauma? Um, and am I individually willing, right, to do that? So openness to difficulty, having awareness, and then responding with courage is really the individual behaviors we can take. So the responding with courage piece is I think kind of the last step here, right? So we notice what's going on. We try to open up to the hard things that are happening. One quote that I think is really powerful is that we hurt where we care, and where we care where we hurt. And so, like, if you're hurting, it's obviously attached to something that's meaningful to you, right? Um, if someone just like opened this door randomly and nothing came out of it, y'all would probably pay attention to it. It would close. Your mind might be like, what was that about? Uh, but if there were no threat or nothing interesting that you wanted to move toward, you would just like go back to your day, right? And so uh, the things that we respond to painfully are things that we find meaningful. And so responding with courage, the way I like to introduce this, I call it ways of being. All of us define how we want to show up in the world. Um, so you could think about courage as responding with your values. I just really like the term ways of being because it's way more active and in the moment. So one of the ways that I like to be is authentically, wholeheartedly, transparently, um, actively. Like those are the things that stick out for me. That's not all the time, but like most places I go, that's what I want. So if you want to think of your own ways of being, think of adverbs, like ways that you can act in any moment. And again, it doesn't always make sense for me to be authentic, right? If I perceive that someone's not paying attention to me and then I like engage with authenticity, I have to acknowledge that I'm exposing myself to risk, right? And so I get to make those sorts of decisions all the time. And I think it's something that we individually can decide. I think the other thing when we're in organizations is assess for ourselves, like, if no one in your organization is being courageous and saying, hey, this matters, like, are you willing to expose yourself to that risk, knowing that it is one? Um, or do you need to change the environment? Whether that means you going to an organization where you can do that, or do you believe that the organization has a learning mindset where they would be willing to hear perspectives and grow? Make sense? So at the individual level, we're talking like emotional intelligence is built, I believe, on developing awareness, opening ourselves to difficulty, and responding with courage when it makes sense to do that. A quick little like suit. What is that? No, that's not the word. What's the thing? Mnemonic device. I was like, pseudonym? No, that's not it. Come on, English teacher. So real. Okay, so that's the individual stuff we can do. Here's a little like format or map that I would encourage you to just like look at, and maybe you could take yourself through an example quickly as I do it here. So, I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm ready for it. So this past week, I had a tough conversation with my manager, um, and got some feedback that one of the perceptions of my performance was I was delivering a session and the slides were like not in a great place by the time that they should have been. Like they just weren't at the quality that they should have been. Um, and I think one of the perceptions was like, oh, is Mark really invested? Is he like spending his time here? Which is like a logical thought to have, right? To be like, slides weren't done in time. Like, what does that mean? Is like doing other stuff? He seems perfectly capable. So maybe he's just like not investing the time he needs to do it. I learned of this perception of me and immediately was like, like this is the worst, right? And so I can use a map like this to like find some grounding. So like, what was I thinking? I was thinking partly like, how dare they think I'm not committed, right? To that's really concerning. Why do they think that I'm not committed or not doing enough on the front end? Also, the feedback was that it was really conceptual, and I was like, "Damn it, I love being conceptual, but also if like I don't need to be practical," and so it just hurt. I like really felt hurt that I was like, I had heard that feedback in my past. I really want to be both like fundamentally conceptual in helping people learn concepts that are valuable, but then also like, how can I apply it? I'm now in this moment concerned that y'all are like, yeah, this is more conceptual than practical, right? These are the things. So I was feeling hurt by that. My mind was just telling me like, a lot of self-protective things, a lot of the reactive things. What do I do? How do I change it? How can I change the perception? And I think probably where I felt it was in my chest, right? It was like right around here. It's like, okay, I notice what's happening. Um, what about opening myself to difficulty? What was really important to me is one, I want to be helpful, and to know that the slides were not in a place that were deemed helpful. That's what I care about, and that's why I'm hurting. I also care about being competent, and the perception that like the quality of the content was not competent for what was needed, that sucked. It hurt. Uh, but that's what I valued, and that's what I cared about, and that's why I was hurting. Um, was there stuff I was trying to avoid? Initially, yes. I was like, I don't know what to do with this feedback. What am I going to do? Um, what I wanted to fix was this person's perceptions, right? I just wanted to go and like plant like, no, here's all the other things you need to know. What's helpful about that though, even if I am trying to fix something in the moment, is like that can be informative for like what can I control and what can I do as I figure out what I want to do going forward. So when I'm responding with courage was like, I want to be open to that. I want to hear it. I want to learn from it. And then if I respond in that way, what am I going to do next? Is my response just trying to protect me from short-term pain that I don't want to feel, closing my fist? Or is it aligning with who I want to be as a person, keeping me open so I can move forward? Walking myself through this process, I was able to be like, you know what I want to do is I want to clarify misunderstandings. I want to create content ahead of time, like way ahead of schedule going forward. So that's what I'm going to do so that we don't have this happen again. And then I'll share the additional context for why this like happened the way that it did. And it put me in a place where I was able to respond what I believe is courageously, hearing difficult feedback, being open to it, and then responding in a way that aligned with what I really care about. Does that make sense? So I want to give you just a minute here, keeping an eye on time. I want to give you a minute just to walk through your own version of this. I will admit, you may not have the time you need in this session to like totally process the thing, but I suspect you can probably pull up a challenge you've had in the past month or so that you've been thinking about. And you're like, wow, I've been holding really tightly to that. It hurts. It's painful. And it might be in one of these veins. It might be something different. But I just want to give you a second to try it out for yourself, to see if you can just mentally go through your own process of like, oh yeah, did I respond in the way I wanted to? Or maybe you're anticipating a conversation that's going to be really hard. You can use this to prepare. I'm going to give you just a couple minutes. And again, I'm just going to ask that you're willing to like hold space for the fact that you may leave this being like, I have to think more about that. Like I didn't go through the whole process because you probably won't have time for it. But I'll give you a few minutes just to at least get started. I'm going to do a quick check-in. Again, not going to ask anyone to share out the content necessarily, but anything you're noticing about trying to ask yourself these questions going through it doesn't have to be positive feedback, by the way. It's okay if it's like, this is hard. I don't really want it. Any reactions? Yeah. I think going through a process like this, right? Because you have to acknowledge and validate the middle section. You have to validate the fact that you're having that experience, which is really tough. And you might not always be ready for that. But it's here for you when you want to develop that so that you can move that in your culture. If you don't do this often yet, your mind and body from your lived experience is going to be like, no, we don't do this. This is not okay. This is not safe. And in fact, it's just like a muscle. When we exercise it and practice it, it gets easier. It gets less hard to do. And I would just encourage you, it's really important through this process to be patient with yourself, to be kind to yourself, because it's not necessarily easy, right? But I think it does allow us long-term to be able to show up as the people we want to be in the places that we're in. Because the reason I teach this stuff is because then I have to practice it. And I think like if you don't know how to get yourself in gear, take my slides, read them, and then go teach them to someone else, and you will feel far more accountable for actually doing it and practicing it. So I think that's just a brilliant point. That why kids are great is it's like, oh, I guess I guess if I want them to do this, I better start showing up and doing it too. Yeah, we hold ourselves to some really high expectations, right? Like the fact that I think I think this is maybe an American thing, but we like adopted a lot of Eastern practices of this work. And then we're like, but I need to do it in the moment, right? Like the A plus work is like being this like perfect responder. And I think realistically, like, no, it was really hard for me in the moment. There were other things I thought of. The good news is I learned to like withdraw and suppress. So I'm still listening and attentive, but it always appears as if I'm open. So that's just like my own pain working in my favor. But yeah, I think it's really the practice, right? I think over time, same thing. Like the more we exercise the muscle, the more open we can be to being in discomfort in a way that we're still engaged. But if like it just depends on where you are in the practice, right? And to expect yourself to get there, and then the first time you're like, I responded with a fight, with fighting in this one conversation. I'm never trying that again, right? Like that's not going to get us where we're trying to go. So I think patience and compassion there is really important. Y'all, I want to move forward because we're just about at time. So the bigger question I think becomes like, how do we start to create this in organizations and build practices? So I've got this cute little analogy. I hope you would all agree that this is like what organizations ultimately are doing. I like to imagine that organizations and people are all like driving vehicles together in like kind of a caravan going to a place. Like we're gonna like do that, and then at some point we're gonna split off roads because like there are other places we want to explore. But ultimately, in my analogy here, trust and being able to move through conflict, that's like the engine and the fuel. If you don't do that well, you will go nowhere or it will break down. It's not going to work. And I think a lot of people who are in the rapid and reactive mindset, for good reason, again, their behavior makes sense, but they're pushing to drive commitment, accountability, and results, right? They're focused on the car moving and the map where they're going, but like they're not doing like the routine maintenance to make sure that it's actually effective to go there. So again, they're kind of like, when you're on the left side, oh boy, I am in a bunch of different places. So when you're on the left side, really hard to get where you're going if you're not thinking about the trust and conflict. So with that, at the team level, I think what needs to be cultivated through a bunch of practice of individuals building those skills, right, the emotional intelligence, is psychological safety, right? We're creating an environment where I can make mistakes, I can mess up, I can learn, and then I can improve, right? I am unwilling to do that hard work individually, the self-awareness work, if it is not safe for me to learn. And so we know that psychological safety is really important. The question is, how do you build that? That's where the practices and routines come in. How can you systematize opportunities to learn and grow together where it's safe to practice self-awareness and learn together, so that we can build an organization where I can be more of myself in those places. The one thing I'll call out here, if you want to type it in your phone, the bit.ly that says team check-ins. This is one of the simplest practices I've like ever engaged with, but I consistently get great feedback. My team meets once a week. We spend 15 minutes together with 3 or 4 people, and everyone gets 2 minutes to just share a life update. Everyone else listens actively. At the end, sometimes we'll have follow-up questions, but it's only 15 minutes. We put some norms around it just to make sure that it's a safe environment for everyone to share. People can be as surface level or vulnerable as they want. You don't have to respond to someone else's check-in. It's just 2 minutes to hear a life update. And people are like, this feels just like a moment of humanity in an otherwise like really work-focused week. So that's a totally free resource. If it's useful, adapt it, use it. I hope that feels practical. The other things that we don't have time to get into today, but are useful, and if I can be of help, I'm happy to share some of these resources. Having feedback frameworks, like frameworks to provide communication, is really valuable to be able to move through conflict, to help managers actually focus on their team's strengths, so we do more of the work we are good at and love to do, less of the work that we're not good at or don't love to do. And then ultimately, of course, you need like OKRs and KPIs because people need clarity and direction. So this, I think, is the blend of systems and processes that are really important, but then also human cultural elements that are easy to skip over when leaders are in that rapid and reactive mindset. I use the word trauma, I think, more openly than a lot of people. Like the word trauma for a lot of us is a pretty heavy word, right? One of the best descriptions I've ever, or definitions of it that I've ever understood or heard was from Gabor Mate, and he talks about like a traumatic experience is when you have an event occur and it essentially consolidates so tightly that the event and what it meant to you appear to be inseparable, right? So the thing that happened and the meaning that you attach to it feel the same, right? And the work of most therapy is to start interjecting space between the experience that happened, which you could not control, and then what your mind decided that it meant. When I tell you the thoughts that come up for me, like I'm not worthy, I could go back and tell you the life events, right, that happened that convinced me of that. And the work as people is like, and some of this work is really just trying to introduce, can I separate the thing that happened from what I understand it to mean? And so I think what's really important is, and you're calling it out, is this happens at work too. Like work is not some like special space where we are no longer human and incapable for trauma to happen, which again is like, for me to like demystify the word, it's just events that occur for whatever reason where it was painful enough that my body is like, this event and what it means are the same thing. That of course happens in the workplace. And so I think it's really, really important that we start introducing and normalizing that these are things that we need to be able to work through. I think it like very much ties into the mental health conversation. And I also would just expect the language that we use to describe these things is going to put people on edge, right? There are a lot of people who have trauma, by the way, that are going to repel from the concept of work being a place where trauma is something we should talk about. And that's their lived experiences showing up that makes them uncomfortable with that. So I think it's like, I would love to say overnight, I would love to see a world where we're like, yeah, we accept that in a workplace trauma happens and we're gonna deal with it. But I think we gotta remember that a lot of the people who are making decisions about that also probably are in a position where they have traumas that they don't understand in the same way. They're things that they've been taught or learned to avoid. And so I think it is a slower road because it's human behavior, and that's hard. I don't know, was that helpful? Cool, thanks for asking. This happened and I didn't even notice. I was so in my train of thought. I hope y'all got this. We're at time. Y'all, if you have any other questions, I would love to spend some time. Please come up and chat. Otherwise, I'm really grateful for your time. I really appreciate you.